the candlelit corridors of the Vatican, there are whispers older than the marble and older than the hymns that echo through its domes. Fear does not always take the shape of demons. Sometimes it is far more ancient, carved in stone long before crosses were raised or Latin psalms were sung. That fear had a name: Heka. To the Egyptians, Heka was not sorcery, not trickery, not superstition. It was the underlying fabric of existence. It was the force that animated words, breath, light, and memory. To command Heka was not to defy nature, but to move with it. Like catching a current in the Nile, like bending fire with the wind. The Vatican's own records, sealed deep beneath layers of restricted catalogs, suggest that priests in Rome debated Egyptian rites long after Christianity had spread across the empire. The devil was a known enemy, and therefore manageable. But Heka was different. It promised direct access to the divine. It offered the possibility that a peasant, a scribe, even a child could speak words that altered reality without the need for a church, a priest, or savior. If that were true, the entire edifice of authority, hierarchies built on obedience and mediation, would collapse. And so, for centuries, the Vatican feared what it never named aloud. Picture the contrast. In Christian doctrine, salvation flowed downward, from God to Christ, from Christ to the church, and finally to the people. In Egyptian belief, power moved upward, from within the soul toward the cosmos. A single word, spoken with intent, could bridge the gap. The Egyptians believed that language was alive. Hieroglyphs were not decorations. They were instruments. To carve a name was to preserve a soul. To erase a name was to kill it twice. To speak the right incantation was to open a door between life and death. In the eyes of Rome, this was not quaint mythology. It was dangerous technology. Early Christian writers did not dismiss Egypt because it was irrelevant. They dismissed it because it was too close. The story of Osiris, death, dismemberment, and resurrection sounded uncomfortably familiar once the gospel spread. The weighing of the heart in the Hall of Mayat echoed later visions of Judgment Day. The image of a God who died and rose again had already been carved into stone thousands of years before Christ. This was not convenient. The church needed to distinguish itself as new, divine, unique. If Egyptian stories lingered, the claim to originality dissolved. And so fear became a weapon. Egypt was recast as a land of idols, sorcerers, false gods. But behind that rhetoric lay unease. For even as priests thundered from pulpits about demons and temptation, in their archives they kept Egyptian scrolls, not to revere but to study, to watch, to control. Some texts were marked not with titles, but with numbers, cataloged, indexed, but hidden. It was as though the church feared forgetting as much as it feared remembering. Destroy the scrolls, and the knowledge might vanish. But hide them, and at least the knowledge was caged, locked behind stone and silence. Consider what Heka truly implied. The Egyptians saw words as seeds. Once spoken, they germinated in reality. A blessing was not a hope, but a planting. A curse was not a threat, but a weapon. Imagine the terror this inspired in Rome. The idea that someone outside their walls, chanting in an old tongue, could shape the world without their sanction. Authority depends on monopoly. The church had to be the sole gatekeeper of miracles, prayers, resurrection. If others could access the divine directly, then control would fracture. The Vatican feared Heka more than the devil because the devil was external. He could be cast out, defeated, condemned in sermons. Heka, however, lived inside every human breath. How do you fight an enemy that is not outside you, but within you? How do you ban words when every tongue carries them? How do you silence memory when it is carved into walls, echoed in chants, and whispered from one generation to the next? That is why their silence is telling. In official decrees, demons are named openly, condemned without hesitation. But Egyptian magic appears in margins, in sealed lists of forbidden books, in catalog numbers that lead nowhere. It was a fear too dangerous to admit. To name it was to awaken it. To denounce it was to give it life again. So they buried it in shadows, hoping it would stay forgotten. And yet, forgotten it was not. Travelers returning from Egypt whispered of temples where sound still lingered, where a single clap of the hands could awaken echoes that seemed alive. Merchants brought amulets inscribed with names the church insisted no one speak. Scholars noticed patterns in Christian prayers that mirrored older Egyptian formulas. Each fragment was small, but together they painted a troubling picture. That beneath the foundations of Christianity lay the echoes of Nile temples, still resonant, still breathing. The Vatican knew. It trembled not at demons, but at memory. At the possibility that people might discover the divine had never been confined to one book, one altar, one savior. That in Egypt, long before Rome, humanity had already learned to touch the infinite with breath and syllable. That was the fear they never spoke aloud. It began with a misfiled chest, a cracked wooden box that should have disappeared into the dust of forgotten storerooms. In 1824, it arrived quietly at a museum in France, tagged as an ordinary relic, just another artifact from the sands of Egypt. Its label was vague, its provenance unclear, and for a time, no one cared. But when the linen wrappings inside were gently unrolled, the scholars froze. They were staring at a papyrus unlike any other. At first glance, it resembled a funerary scroll, the kind buried with the dead to guide them into the afterlife. But as the first lines were translated, something stirred. It did not speak of burial rites or gods demanding offerings. It spoke of breath, of light, of words uttered at precise moments to bend the world. It read less like scripture, more like instruction, like a manual, a spell book. And within days, its reputation had already outgrown the walls of the museum. The Vatican heard. They always did. Messengers were dispatched in secret, cloaked as scholars, but carrying orders far heavier than research. Acquire it at any cost. Within weeks, the chest was gone. The museum's drawers sat empty. No record, no explanation, just silence. But silence is its own kind of confession. Why would the church care about a forgotten papyrus? Why would agents travel across borders to erase it? The answer lies in its description. The text spoke of priests who could command winds with a whisper, of temples designed not only as monuments, but as instruments, their chambers echoing human voices into power, of symbols that were not writing but tools, unlocking unseen realms when pronounced in the correct order. To the Egyptians, this was not superstition. It was precision, ritual as technology, faith as method. For Rome, this was intolerable. Christianity claimed that miracles flowed only through God's chosen channels. Yet here was a scroll suggesting that human words alone, arranged in the right rhythm, could shape creation. No priest, no sacrament, no church, just breathe. Imagine what such an idea could do to a religion built on hierarchy. Imagine the cracks it would carve into authority. The papyrus became a ghost story among archivists. Some say it was sealed beneath the Vatican library, encased in lead to keep its power dormant. Others believe fragments escaped, hidden by monks unwilling to destroy what they believed sacred. There are whispers that parts of its language slipped into early Christian prayers, concealed under Latin syllables, altered just enough to pass unnoticed. A prayer that begins like any other might once have been a spell guiding the soul through darkness. A hymn sung in candlelight might echo chants once heard in Nile temples. The Vatican's fear was not fantasy. It was control. If people believed their voices carried power, the monopoly of salvation collapsed. If anyone could speak to the divine directly, priests became unnecessary. A structure of obedience, carefully built over centuries, would crumble overnight. Letters from the 19th century hint at the panic. A scholar mentions a manuscript that vanished before its danger could spread. A priest in Rome writes of a text whose very syllables open gates we are not permitted to see. Even more chilling is the catalog of banned works quietly updated after the papyrus disappeared. No title, no author, just a number that never appeared in any public system. The papyrus should not have existed, and once it was found, it should have stayed forgotten. But its disappearance told a different story. It told of fear. Fear that the Egyptians were not just architects of stone, but custodians of something older, something far more dangerous than demons. Knowledge that bypassed faith entirely, that required no church to mediate. To this day, no one outside the Vatican has seen the papyrus again. But its trail remains. A whisper in letters, sketches in forbidden notebooks, rumors of translations hidden in margins. Every fragment points to the same conclusion. The Egyptians believed words were not merely sounds. They were reality waiting to be shaped. And that, more than devils, more than heretics, was what the Vatican could not allow. For the devil could be cast out with ritual. But words, alive, breathing, eternal, once spoken, could never be recalled. The Egyptians did not believe words were symbols. They believed words were alive. Each syllable carried weight, vibration, force. Spoken at the right moment, in the right order, by the right lips, it was more than communication. It was creation. They called this force Heka, the magic of speech, the energy of intention turned sound. To utter a name was to awaken it. To carve a hieroglyph was to bind it into eternity. In the temples of Karnak and Luxor, priests trained not only in silence, but in resonance. They practiced tones that echoed across stone chambers, chants that turned air into energy. When they spoke, walls vibrated, statues trembled. The ancients believed those vibrations did not fade into nothing. They reshaped the invisible fabric of reality. A blessing was not hope, it was action. A curse was not metaphor, it was a blow. In Egypt, words were weapons, instruments, seeds of worlds. One of the most chilling truths about this belief lies in their funerary practices. To erase a name was to kill a soul. If a pharaoh's name was scratched from stone, his spirit was annihilated. Conversely, to speak a name aloud was to resurrect it. Memory became immortality, preserved by breath. This was not mere poetry. This was cosmic law, and the Vatican knew it. Compare this to Christian doctrine. In the Bible, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The echo is undeniable. Language is divine, speech is Genesis. Yet the difference is subtle, dangerous. In Christianity, the Word belonged to God, not humanity. It flowed downwards, holy and untouchable. In Egypt, the Word flowed upward, accessible to anyone trained to wield it. Power was not locked in heaven. It was already inside the human chest, waiting for release. That was the terror. Because if words themselves were sacred technology, then salvation was not a gift to be mediated, but a skill to be practiced. Authority lost its monopoly. A peasant could chant like a priest. A scribe could preserve a soul with ink. A mother whispering her child's name could grant eternity. Where was the need for bishops, for cathedrals, for sacraments? The Vatican could not fight this belief openly. To denounce it risked comparison with its own rituals. Latin prayers were already spoken in precise rhythms. Gregorian chants already altered consciousness with their tones. Mass itself resembled an Egyptian rite. Candles, incense, holy words. Too many similarities, too many echoes. So the church chose a different path. It demonized. Egyptian chants became incantations. Egyptian gods became devils. Heka became witchcraft. What was once sacred memory was reframed as dangerous sorcery. The people were taught to fear the very power their ancestors had revered. And yet, in secret, Rome preserved fragments. Priests studied forbidden scrolls under lock and key, because to destroy knowledge is to risk losing it forever. And even those who feared it most could not bear to let it vanish. Reports survive of monks who slipped Egyptian words into Christian prayers, cloaking them in Latin to hide their origins. Certain hymns still carry rhythms that scholars trace back to Nile rituals. Even the simple act of crossing oneself may echo gestures once carved into tomb walls. The church silenced Egyptian speech publicly, but privately, it absorbed, reshaped, and reused. Why? Because words work. Anyone who has felt their skin shiver at a sentence, or wept at a lyric, or trembled at a whispered name knows this. Words alter emotion. Emotion alters memory. And memory shapes destiny. This is not fantasy. It is human experience. The Egyptians simply named it Heka and built a civilization around it. The Vatican feared the devil less than this. Devils can be banished. Heretics can be silenced. But words live on. They hide in manuscripts. They cling to melodies. They pass from tongue to tongue like sparks in dry grass. You cannot kill them without killing the people who speak them. And so the church tried something else. It taught that words not sanctioned by Rome were evil. It created fear of freedom, fear of language outside its walls. And for a time, it worked. But the stones remember. In Egypt, temples still hum when the wind moves through their chambers. Hieroglyphs still stare with eyes that do not blink. Names carved 4,000 years ago still carry the weight of breath. And perhaps that is why, even now, the Vatican locks certain scrolls away in silence. Not because they are lies, but because they still carry charge. Because words, once alive, never die.
Walk into a medieval church, and you will see faces of saints in stained glass, angels carved into stone, demons crouched in corners. But look closer. Some of those demons have the heads of animals, jackals, hawks, lions. Their shapes are familiar but not Christian. They are Egyptian. Anubis, the jackal-headed guardian of the dead, once guided souls gently into the afterlife. His presence was not evil. He was a protector, a psychopomp, ensuring that the journey beyond death was orderly. Yet in the hands of early Christian writers his image twisted. The jackal became a demon's mask. His quiet role as caretaker of the dead was erased, replaced with accusations of sorcery and darkness. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing and wisdom, once honored as the scribe of the gods, became something else. His scrolls, once thought to contain divine truth, were reframed as grimoires of sorcery. His wisdom was recast as trickery. And Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of both healing and destruction, became an emblem of chaos. stripped of her role as a cosmic balance. This was no accident. It was strategy. The church faced a problem in Egypt that no sword could solve. The temples were too old, too enduring. The gods were too woven into daily life. Egyptian religion was not just belief. It was memory carved into stone, repeated in ritual, painted across tombs. To erase it would take centuries. But to demonize it, that could work quickly. So the transformation began. Egyptian deities were given new names in Christian sermons: Satan, Lucifer, Devil. The more feared they became, the less people would dare to question them. A child growing up in a Christian village might see the face of Anubis and feel not reverence but dread. Memory was rewritten. Familiarity became fear. The strategy was subtle but devastating. By labeling the gods as demons, the church stripped them of nuance. People were not taught to ask who Anubis was, or what Thoth taught, or why Sekhmet mattered. They were taught only to recoil. The gods became caricatures of evil, shadows cast by a new faith determined to stand alone in the light. But traces of the truth survived. Look at the oldest manuscripts, and you see strange overlaps. In certain illuminated text, winged figures bear resemblance to Horus falcons. In the corners of cathedrals, carved eyes watch without blinking. Echoes of the Eye of Ra, disguised but still present. Even halos, those glowing circles around saints, resemble the sun discs carried by Egyptian gods. The church could not erase Egypt completely. Too many fragments had already been absorbed. Too many stories had been retold. The child Horus, born of the goddess Isis, watched over by divine forces, raced to battle chaos. Does this sound familiar? Centuries later, in another land, the story of another miraculous child would be told, one who faced darkness and restored order. The parallels were uncomfortable. The Vatican needed Egypt forgotten. This was why demonization worked so well. Once Egypt was painted as dark, as pagan, as demonic, its wisdom could be ignored. Its memory could be sealed under warnings of danger. Do not read these texts. Do not speak these names. Fear was the lock, silence the chain. And yet, in hidden corners of Europe, scholars whispered otherwise. Some monks smuggled fragments of Egyptian prayers, copying them in the margins of psalms. Others, fascinated by symbols, traced them into coded diagrams. They risked excommunication, even death, because they suspected a deeper truth, that Egypt had not been demonic at all. It had been foundational. The Vatican's fear was not of devils, but of recognition. That someone might see the jackal not as Satan, but as Anubis. That they might remember Thoth not as a demon, but as the teacher of writing, the very art that preserves scripture. That Sekhmet was not chaos, but balance. Recognition could undo centuries of demonization. Recognition could remind humanity of a past that had been buried deliberately. So the campaign of transformation endured. Egypt was made into shadow. Its gods were renamed, its rituals condemned, its temples broken. But shadows never vanish completely. They linger at the edges of stained glass, at the corners of manuscripts, in the very symbols the church adopted while pretending to destroy them. And perhaps that was the greatest irony. In turning gods into devils, the church ensured they would never be forgotten. Fear, after all, is a powerful form of memory.
There was a time when no one in Europe could read the walls of Egypt. Thousands of symbols stretched across temples, tombs, and obelisks. Lines of birds, eyes, suns, snakes, and stars. To travelers, they were decorations, strange ornaments. To priests of the church, they were worse. Threats. Because those symbols were not mute. They were words, alive and waiting. And if they were ever read again, they could tell a history that contradicted everything the church claimed. So the Vatican acted early. In the Middle Ages, scholars warned that hieroglyphs were the language of sorcerers. They whispered that to study them was to invite madness. To speak them aloud could open doors that should remain closed. And slowly, fear did what fire could not. The symbols became untouchable. Any attempt to translate them was silenced. Manuscripts that speculated too deeply were confiscated. Libraries that dared to house Egyptian scrolls mysteriously burned. Why? Not because the church feared demons lurking in the shapes of birds and eyes. They feared memory. Hieroglyphs carried stories of a world far older than Genesis. Stories of gods who came from the stars, of civilizations before Adam, of floods and resurrections written centuries before Moses. If those stories were ever read aloud, the foundations of biblical chronology would shake. The church could not allow that. For centuries, the strategy worked. Egypt remained mute. The temples loomed silent giants. The walls glittered with colors no one understood. To the people of Europe, they were relics of idolatry, pagan stains left behind in the desert. The church's authority stayed secure because the past remained unread. But whispers continued. Arab scholars who preserved fragments of Greek texts hinted that hieroglyphs were not decoration, but language. Renaissance alchemists, fascinated by symbols, sketched them into hidden diagrams. Some monks scrawled notes in margins, half translations, half prayers, before their manuscripts vanished into locked vaults. And all the while, the church maintained its decree: do not translate, do not ask. The true reason was always the same. Hieroglyphs recorded a timeline of humanity that did not match the Bible. Pharaohs ruled for thousands of years before Abraham. Myths of resurrection, judgment, and divine rebirth appeared long before Christianity. And worst of all, the Egyptians claimed their wisdom came from beings who walked with them, gods not above, but present. To admit this would collapse the carefully built hierarchy of salvation. By keeping hieroglyphs unreadable, the Vatican kept memory buried. The symbols became tombs within tombs, voices trapped in silence. Even when explorers brought back obelisks to Europe, they stood as mute trophies, their true meaning hidden. Few noticed that they were placed in prominent squares, including St. Peter's Basilica, where one still stands today. An Egyptian monument, carrying Egyptian words, planted at the heart of Christianity's capital. Its presence was tolerated because its voice was locked away. But silence cannot last forever. By the 18th century, curiosity returned. Scholars began collecting fragments, comparing symbols. Some suspected a code. Others insisted the writing was purely symbolic, incapable of phonetic speech. And still, in Vatican corridors, warnings echoed, "Do not let the past speak." The fear was not superstition, it was calculation. Because once the script was unlocked, the people might ask questions no bishop could answer. If Egypt spoke of resurrection long before Christ, then whose story was original? If Egypt mapped the stars with precision beyond medieval astronomy, then where did that knowledge come from? If Egyptian spells preserved the soul, then what was the church's monopoly on salvation worth? So the script remained forbidden, not by decree on every street corner, but by whispered censorship. Translators were denied support, texts were mislabeled, access to papyri was restricted. A subtle prison built not of walls, but of silence. And yet, Egypt waited. The hieroglyphs endured storms, wars, conquests, They endured the erasures of priests and the neglect of empires. They endured because stone remembers what ink forgets. And one day, a man would arrive with the key to their voice. A man who would do what the Vatican feared most: break the seal of silence and let the walls speak again. In 1822, in a quiet study in France, a young scholar leaned over a slab of stone. His name was Jean-François Champollion, and his obsession had consumed him for years. He had filled notebooks with sketches of strange birds, eyes, and serpents. He had memorized patterns no one else cared to understand. He was chasing a voice that had been silent for centuries. The Rosetta Stone lay before him, a gift of chance, a relic pulled from the sands by Napoleon's soldiers, later claimed by the British. On its surface were 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphs. 3 versions of the same decree. It was a code, a bridge between worlds, and Champollion would be the one to cross it. Day after day, he compared Greek to Demotic, Demotic to hieroglyph. He noticed that the symbols were not pictures alone. They were sounds, syllables, phonetics. He realized what the church had denied for centuries. Egyptian writing was a language, not a riddle. And once he spoke it aloud, the walls began to answer. When the breakthrough came, it was like lightning. Champollion raced into his brother's office, shouting, "I've got it!" He collapsed to the floor, overcome by exhaustion. But the silence of Egypt was broken forever. The hieroglyphs spoke again, and what they said was shocking. These were not the words of a primitive people lost in superstition. They were records of astronomy so precise that modern scientists still marvel. They were calendars older than the flood. They were rituals for healing, spells for protection, prayers for resurrection. They were not myth. They were method. For the first time in over a millennium, the past could be read without the Vatican's filter. And Rome trembled. Because what Champollion uncovered confirmed the Church's greatest fear: that the Egyptians had spoken of truths long before Christianity claimed them. The Book of the Dead told of judgment after death, of a soul weighed against truth. It spoke of resurrection, of life renewed in fields of eternity. It described divine beings who died and rose again, who guided humanity through light and shadow. Osiris, dismembered and reborn. Horus, born of a miraculous union. These were not echoes of Christianity. Christianity was the echo of them. The Vatican could not stop Champollion, but they could contain the damage. Access to certain texts was restricted. Translations were censored, pages left blank, passages omitted. Museums locked away fragments that spoke too clearly of rebirth, of divine light within the human soul. The official narrative declared these beliefs myth, stripping them of authority, reducing them to curiosities. But behind closed doors, the Church studied them, quietly, fearfully, because the truth was out now. The hieroglyphs revealed that humanity's oldest memories were not of devils, but of gods who taught balance, healing, resurrection. Egyptian priests were not sorcerers, but scientists of spirit. Their temples were not houses of idols, but laboratories of sound and light. And their words carried power long before the Vatican claimed ownership of prayer. The Church's monopoly cracked. People began to ask questions. Why did Egyptian texts describe resurrection before the Gospels? Why did they speak of baptism in the Nile before Jordan's waters? Why did their calendars align with stars while medieval Europe still stumbled through time? Champollion himself knew the danger. He confided in letters that some translations were too unsettling to publish. He feared they would be suppressed or worse, destroyed. He was right. Certain papyri vanished into private collections, snapped up by agents of powerful institutions. Others were miscatalogued, buried in archives. The Vatican had lost control of the code, but they could still control the flow of its revelations. The hieroglyphs had been freed, but not entirely. Even today, not all texts are public. Some tombs remain sealed. Some inscriptions are photographed, but not translated. The silence is thinner, but it is not gone. Still, the damage was done. Egypt had spoken again, and what it said was undeniable. The story of humanity is older, stranger, and far more magical than the church ever allowed us to believe. And that was the real fear. Not demons, not heretics, but memory. Memory written in stone, finally remembered. Long before a cross rose in Jerusalem, the walls of Egypt told a different story. In hieroglyphs carved deep into tombs, in papyri buried with the dead. A theme repeated again and again. Death was not the end. It was a threshold, and beyond it lay judgment, renewal, and life eternal. The Egyptians believed the soul was weighed in the hall of Ma'at, a feather of truth balanced against the heart of the deceased. If the scales tipped true, the soul was welcomed into the fields of reeds, a paradise of abundance. If it failed, the soul dissolved into nothing. It was not punishment, not eternal torment. It was erasure. Life continued only if you had lived in harmony with cosmic order. This judgment scene feels hauntingly familiar. In Christian scripture, a day comes when the dead rise, when their deeds are measured, when they stand before divine justice, heaven or damnation. The structure is nearly identical, though clothed in different names. The Book of the Dead contained spells of resurrection. Spell 168, whispered in tombs, spoke of the body rising again, of breath returning, of a soul reborn in eternal light. It was a ritual of rebirth, written centuries before any gospel. It described crossing a river, being washed clean, stepping into radiant fields. Does that sound like baptism or paradise? Osiris, the god who was killed, dismembered, and restored, was called the one who died and rose. His son Horus, born of Isis's miraculous gathering of his father's scattered body, battled darkness to restore order. Death and rebirth, father and son, a cycle of salvation told in stone long before the Christian cross. The Vatican could not ignore this. The parallels were too sharp. If the Egyptian resurrection myth came first, then Christianity was not invention, but inheritance. The seed of resurrection was already alive in Nile temples. And that was dangerous knowledge. It threatened the claim of originality, the claim of exclusive truth. So the church silenced it. Translations of the Book of the Dead were limited. Passages about rebirth and eternal life were omitted from published editions. Museums withheld fragments that described resurrection too vividly. Egypt's voice was softened, framed as myth rather than theology. But the echoes remained. Consider baptism. In Christianity, water cleanses sin, marking a rebirth into spiritual life. In Egypt, water also played this role. The Nile itself was sacred, a river of renewal. Priests used water to purify, to prepare the dead for their journey, to initiate the living into sacred mysteries. The ritual was older than Jordan's banks. Consider communion. Christians eat bread and drink wine as symbols of body and blood. In Egypt, offerings of bread and beer were given to Osiris, symbols of death and regeneration. In both cases, consuming the sacred meant participating in eternal cycles. The Vatican's fear was not of lies, but of recognition. Recognition that Egypt had already mapped the afterlife. Recognition that Christianity, instead of inventing resurrection, had repackaged it. Recognition that divine rebirth might not belong to one religion at all, but to humanity's oldest memory. This was the dangerous idea. Because if resurrection was universal, if judgment and renewal were truths written in stone long before the Gospels, then the monopoly of salvation shattered. People might ask, why need the church at all? If Osiris opened the way before Christ, if the Book of the Dead offered the same promises as Revelation, then authority dissolves. So the church did what it always did with dangerous truths. It buried them. It whispered heresy. It locked the scrolls in archives and told the world Egypt was nothing but idols and devils. But the walls remembered. And when the hieroglyphs spoke again, they told the story clearly. Resurrection was not born in a tomb in Jerusalem. It was born in the black earth of the Nile.
Most people today think of alchemy as a joke. Old men in smoky chambers mixing powders, dreaming of gold. But in Egypt it was never about metal. It was about transformation. Not of lead into gold, but of the soul into light. The word itself betrays its origin. Alchemy comes from alchemia, the black earth. Chem, the fertile soil of the Nile, the place where life began. To the Egyptians, this black earth was not just land. It was a symbol of potential, of raw material waiting to be reborn. For them, alchemy was inner science. Every substance carried layers, physical, mental, spiritual. Change one, and the others could follow. Lead symbolized ignorance, heaviness, decay. Gold symbolized clarity, radiance, eternity. The work of alchemy was to turn the lead inside oneself into gold, to burn away shadows until only light remained. Rituals mirrored this transformation. Priests used colors, black for beginnings, red for struggle, white for purification, gold for completion. They used scents to shift the mind, chants to shift the spirit. To modernize it looks like magic, but to them it was method. A system of steps guiding a soul toward awakening. This idea terrified the church, because in Egyptian alchemy, salvation did not require priests, it required discipline. Anyone could purify themselves, awaken the spark inside, step closer to the divine. No baptism, no confession, no authority outside yourself. Freedom cloaked as ritual, independence hidden in symbol. So the Vatican turned it into heresy. They declared alchemy pagan, dangerous, the work of sorcerers. Publicly, they ridiculed it. Men chasing gold, fools chasing smoke. Privately, they studied it. In monasteries, Christian mystics quietly copied Egyptian formulas. They rewrote them into Christian terms. The soul passing through fire, purification before heaven, transformation through suffering. The connection to Egypt was erased, but the structure remained. Even in scripture, traces survive. Phrases about refining gold in fire, about being made new, about becoming vessels of light, these echo alchemical stages. They are Egyptian in rhythm, but Christian in clothing. A hidden lineage. The real goal of alchemy, some whispered, was not just purity, it was awakening. The Egyptians believed the body carried dormant energy, a spark of divinity buried beneath flesh. Through chants, breath, geometry, ritual alignment with the stars, this spark could ignite. The awakened soul could see beyond time, heal beyond medicine, remember beyond death. To the Vatican, this was the ultimate threat. If every human carried divine fire, what need was there for priests to mediate? If enlightenment was a process, not a sacrament, then the church's grip loosened. And so the old wisdom was buried under ridicule. Alchemy became a fairy tale. lead into gold, a false pursuit, a failure. But the failure was deliberate, it kept the truth hidden, yet traces remain. Look at medieval grimoires, and you see Egyptian symbols rewritten as Christian diagrams. Look at Hermetic text whispered during the Renaissance, and you find Egyptian alchemy disguised as philosophy. Look at the word philosopher's stone, and you hear echoes of something older, the sacred stone that Egyptians believed held the secret of immortality. The Vatican did not fear fools melting metals. They feared seekers transforming themselves, because a soul turned to gold is the soul that cannot be ruled, and perhaps that is the real treasure Egypt offered. Not wealth, but memory. A map to freedom written in color, scent, word, and star. A map that even now whispers from beneath centuries of silence.
Picture a tomb, lit by flickering torches. A priest stands over the body of a pharaoh. In his hand, a sacred tool carved from stone. He leans forward, touching the lips of the dead, not to mourn, to awaken. This was the opening of the mouth ritual, one of the most sacred acts of ancient Egypt, and one of the most feared by the Vatican. The Egyptians believed death was not silence. It was a crossing. But to cross, the soul needed its senses, eyes to see, ears to hear, a mouth to speak its name. Without a name, the soul was lost. Without speech, it could not defend itself in judgment. Without voice, it could not call to the gods. The ritual restored these powers. The priest commanded, "Rise, speak, remember." And to the Egyptians, it worked. To early Christian scholars, the idea was terrifying. The thought of restoring speech after death reeked of necromancy. To speak with the dead was sin. To awaken them was blasphemy. Only God could give life. Only Christ could command resurrection. And yet, here was a rite thousands of years old, claiming to do just that. The church responded with fear. The ritual was declared satanic. Priests of Egypt were accused of summoning demons. Translations were banned. Scholars who studied it risked exile, even death. In public sermons, the opening of the mouth was held up as proof of Egypt's darkness. But in private, the Vatican kept records. Quietly, carefully, because beneath the fear lay recognition. The ritual was not chaos. It was order. It was science of the spirit. Incense, chants, tools, words. Each element timed with precision. A choreography of awakening. It was not fantasy. It was method. And if it worked, then the Egyptians had tapped into something the church could not control. What if death was not silence? What if the soul could be sustained by memory and voice? What if resurrection did not need a savior, but a sentence spoken in the right rhythm? That was the danger. Not that it was false, but that it might be true. Modern Egyptology has shown that the opening of the mouth was part of a larger system. It was not about raising zombies, but about guiding the soul through transition. It kept memory alive. It gave the dead their name, their identity, their story. It turned silence into continuity. In a way, it was compassion disguised as magic. But the Vatican could not allow such compassion to compete with doctrine. To them, Egypt's ritual blurred the line between miracle and method. And that line had to remain sharp. Otherwise, people might ask, if Egyptians could grant voice after death, what made Christ unique? If the soul could be guided without the church, what was the church for? So the ritual was erased. Scholars who studied it vanished from records. Manuscripts describing it disappeared into archives. Even when translations surfaced in the 19th century, parts were missing, details softened. The opening of the mouth became a curiosity, a pagan superstition. But the truth was simpler. It was a blueprint for memory beyond death. And maybe that is why it still lingers in whispers. Because the Egyptians believed a name spoken keeps the soul alive. And every time their ritual is remembered, every time their words are spoken, their memory resists the silence. That is what the Vatican feared. Not demons in the tomb, but voices in the dark. Voices that remembered a time before priests ruled salvation. Voices that refused to stay buried. In the dim chambers of Egyptian temples, where torches flickered against walls covered in stars, a quiet order worked in secrecy. They were the priests of Thoth, guardians of language, keepers of memory, custodians of what the Egyptians called the raw speech of creation. Thoth was no ordinary god. With the head of an ibis and the wisdom of eternity, he was said to have invented writing, measured time, and recorded the words that bound the cosmos together. He was scribe of the gods, architect of spells, author of the Book of the Dead. And his priests, those who served in his shadow, were entrusted with a burden heavier than gold: the preservation of divine knowledge. They were not like ordinary priests who blessed fields or prayed for rain. They were scholars, scribes, mystics. They studied the stars as if they were sentences. They carved symbols into papyrus and stone, each line a key, each curve a command. They spoke words not as requests, but as invocations, speech meant to bend the fabric of reality. For centuries, they passed this knowledge from one generation to the next, hidden in layers of riddle and poetry. They believed words were alive, that to write a name was to anchor a soul, that to chant a sequence was to open a door between worlds. This was not superstition. It was their science, their way of holding the universe together. But then came a new religion, born in Judea and rising through Rome, a religion that would not tolerate competition. When Christianity spread, the Vatican turned its gaze to Egypt. The spells of Thoth were too powerful to dismiss, too threatening to ignore. And so the purge began. Temples were destroyed, scrolls were burned. The priests of Thoth were branded servants of darkness. Their god was recast as a demon, their wisdom as sorcery. Yet not everything vanished. Some priests foresaw the storm. They disguised their teachings in Greek philosophy. They buried texts in desert caves, hidden among Gnostic gospels and apocryphal writings. They encoded rituals and riddles so obscure only initiates could decipher them. Fragments survived in Hermetic texts, whispered centuries later in secret societies. And even the Church, in silence, kept what it condemned. For deep in Vatican archives, there are documents that mention Thoth by name. Coptic scrolls filled with invocations, star charts that do not match modern astronomy. Pages so fragile they crumble at the touch, yet so dangerous they are never destroyed. Why keep what they claimed was evil? Perhaps to study, perhaps to control. Perhaps because they knew that memory, once erased, has a way of returning. The priests of Thoth believed that knowledge itself was divine, that to learn was to worship, that curiosity was a form of prayer. And that was the greatest threat of all. Because if truth could be found in stars and syllables, if the divine could be written and spoken by any who sought it, then no priesthood could hold monopoly over salvation. The Church silenced them not because they were wrong, but because they remembered too much. They remembered a time when knowledge was freedom, when words were bridges, when wisdom was not locked behind altars, but sung under the open sky. And maybe that is why whispers of Thoth never fully disappeared, because his priests carried a promise that knowledge cannot be destroyed. It can only be hidden. And hidden things have a way of waiting. Night in Egypt was never empty. The sky was a library. Every star a syllable. Every constellation a sentence read aloud by the desert wind. Priests climbed stairways of stone to listen. They did not worship the lights above. They conversed with them. They believed the heavens were not separate from earth, but a mirror, an echo, a partner. When the sky moved, the temples answered. When a star rose, a door opened. And at the heart of that language, coiled and patient, was the serpent. To the Egyptians, the serpent was not only a creature. It was a current, energy made visible, a line that threaded worlds together, life to death, earth to sky, body to spirit. On ceilings at Dendera and Edfu, painted snakes wind through constellations. Their bodies curve around stars like script around meaning. They are not decorations. They are instructions. Follow the serpent, and you will find the path. Name the serpent, and you will awaken the power that flows through all living things. Temples were tuned instruments. Stones were placed where starlight fell. Passageways aligned to solstices and heliacal risings. Once a year, a beam of dawn would pierce a dark chamber and strike the face of a god. The priests did not gasp. They kept time. They whispered syllables into that light, and the chamber hummed like a plucked string. It was not spectacle. It was calibration, ritual woven to the cadence of the cosmos. They called the serpent many names. In one form it encircled the world, tail in mouth, sign of cycles without end. In another, it rose as a cobra from the brow of kings, a living flame of protection. Sometimes it spiraled, a ladder of light. Sometimes it lay across the sky, a river of stars mirroring the Nile. Whatever its shape, it meant movement, transformation, passage. This was knowledge the church could not abide. Astrology in Christian hands became a sin, not because it was foolish, but because it was effective. If timing mattered, if a ritual worked better when Sirius rose or when Orion cleared the horizon, then the universe obeyed laws outside Rome's permission. If constellations could be keys, then anyone with eyes and patience could unlock doors. No bishop required. So the serpent was slandered. The symbol of medicine became the emblem of deception. The sign of renewal became the signature of evil. Yet the image refused to die. It resurfaced in manuscript margins. It coiled around staffs in hospitals. It glimmered in halos shaped like sun discs, circling heads as if the light itself were a serpent made radiant. The church could rename it, but it could not unsee it. The motif was already carved into the foundations of faith. Consider the calendar. Christmas stands near the winter solstice. Easter pivots on equinox and full moon. Feast days drift with the sky as if yoked to invisible gears. Officially, these are holy choices. Unofficially, they are echoes of older mathematics. The Egyptians timed festivals to match cosmic turning points when the world felt thin, when the veil trembled. The church adopted the timing and denied the origin. Light/dark, memory, forgetfulness. Walk into St. Peter's Square at noon. The obelisk at the center casts a shadow like a moving hand on a giant clock. It is a gnomon older than the basilica, older than the empire that stole it. Draw lines from its base and you can track the sun's year. The serpent of light crawls up the shaft each day and slips down the other side each night. The Vatican did not build this tool, but it uses it. A concession to gravity, to geometry, to the fact that the sky refuses to be baptized. The serpent's other secret is breath. In temple hymns, the sound SS imitates wind through reeds, a hiss that carries intention. It is the whisper of movement, the friction of turning. Priests used sibilant pulses to ride breath like a river. When paired with star names, those hisses were oars. Push, pull, guide. The ritual's force was not only in words, but in the spaces between them. Inhalation and exhalation braided to the slow march of constellations. Rome called this sorcery. Then it copied the rhythm. Chant returned to cathedrals. Monks sang in tones that leveled the mind, that steadied breath, that lifted hearts into a common beat. The serpent was gone, at least in name. The stars were exiled from pulpit and prayer. But the method remained. Control the breath, control the mind, control the flock. In the Renaissance, Hermeticists tiptoed back toward the sky. They drew diagrams of spheres nested like shells, angels posted at planetary gates. Many believed they were studying Greek wisdom. They were studying Egypt translated into Greek skin. The serpent hid in curves of geometry, in the coiling of alchemical retorts, in the spiral of the philosopher's ascent. The church tolerated it until it did not. Bans followed. Books disappeared. Yet the serpent, patient as ever, shed one skin and grew another. Why fear a symbol? Because symbols are engines. They compress memory into image, instruction into shape. The serpent tells the body to move, the lungs to breathe deeper, the mind to coil and uncoil around an idea until it springs to life. It is a reminder that change is not linear. It spirals, and all spiral paths eventually return to their source. If people follow that curve back far enough, they might find Egypt waiting, not as villain, but as origin, not as darkness, but as light taught in shadow. The church could not permit a cosmos alive with voice, a cosmos that sings back when spoken to, a dome that is not ceiling but ear. Such a world makes priests unnecessary and obedience optional. In a living universe, prayer becomes dialogue, timing becomes technology, and salvation looks less like a gate and more like a door you learn to open. The serpent is that door's handle. Grasp it, twist, pass through. And so the policy remained. Silence the stars, strike the serpent, paint both with fear. Yet the night is stubborn. Ask any pilgrim who has camped beneath desert skies. The constellations arrange themselves like letters on a vast page. The Milky Way spills like ink. You feel small and infinite at once. You feel watched and welcomed. You understand, without books, why a priest would wait for a single alignment just to say a single word. What if that is all Egyptian magic ever was? Listening until the moment is exact, then speaking with it instead of at it. What if the serpent is not an enemy to be slain, but a cue to breathe with the turning of the world? What if the real blasphemy is forgetting that the sky has always been our first cathedral? The Vatican fears serpents and stars because both are teachers, quiet ones. They do not command. They reveal. They whisper that the universe is participatory, that you are part of the song, not merely an audience, that the divine does not only descend, it rises in you when you learn the rhythm. And somewhere, in a locked room below Rome, there is likely a chart with lines that do not match modern maps of the heavens. Older grids, older names. A serpent traced across them like a signature. A reminder they dare not burn. Because even if the paper turns to ash, the pattern returns each night, indifferent to edicts. The sky keeps speaking. The serpent keeps moving. The song continues. At the heart of St. Peter's Square stands a needle of red granite that does not belong to Rome. It is older than the basilica, older than the empire that stole it, older, perhaps, than the stories told beneath its shadow. The stone rose first beneath the Egyptian sun, likely in Heliopolis, the city of the sun, where priests measured light as if it were scripture. It crossed seas on imperial orders and was planted by a Roman emperor in a circus where chariots raced and martyrs died. Centuries later, when Christendom had claimed the city and crowned it holy, a pope decided the pagan monument would not be toppled. It would be moved, consecrated, harnessed. The year was 1586. The plan, audacious. Engineers drew diagrams like battle maps. Ropes thicker than arms were woven. Towers of timber rose. Hundreds of men gathered, silent under threat of excommunication for speaking during the lift. At dawn, the order was given. The obelisk creaked. The square held its breath. Then, legend says, a sailor disobeyed. He shouted for water to cool fraying ropes. He broke the decree. The ropes held. The obelisk lived. And the Pope, rather than punish, rewarded. The rule bent to save the stone. Light heat, silence, voice. Control adaptation. When the dust settled, the ancient needle stood at the exact center of Christianity's most public embrace. Two enormous colonnades would later sweep around it like open arms. But the geometry is older than welcome. It is a compass, a clock. At noon, the shadow of the obelisk crawls across the paving stones like a hand marking time. Discs in the stone mark solstices and equinoxes. The square becomes a sundial. The sun writes on Rome with Egyptian ink. Why keep the obelisk? Why not break it? Smash the idol? Purge the square? Declare the city clean? Because some things are not destroyed so easily. And because the church has always known how to borrow power while renaming it. On the summit where once a bronze orb glinted, rumored falsely to hold Caesar's ashes, a cross was mounted. Inside, they say, a relic. The tip of a sunrod turned into a reliquary. Pagan spine with Christian crown, light/dark. Pagan, holy. The merger is not an accident. It is policy. And underneath, stone foundations sink into soil that holds layers of Rome. Imperial brick, medieval rubble, Christian crypts. When the obelisk was raised, a trench was opened and closed. In official reports, nothing unusual was found. But rumors do not read reports. They listen to workers who swear that a stone stairway led downward to a chamber without inscriptions. They repeat stories of a sealed niche, lined with lead, opened for an instant and shut forever. They whisper of a slab marked not with Latin, not with Greek, but with lines that curved like snakes and flickered like heat. Perhaps this is fantasy. Perhaps there was only earth. But the square behaves as if a question was asked and never answered. Every day, crowds cross the meridian without knowing it. The obelisk throws its shadow like a needle drawing a thread through time. Noon stitches today to yesterday. The sundial is a sermon that speaks without words. The sky rules the hour. The stone obeys the sky. And the city obeys the stone. Who then commands whom? The base of the obelisk carries inscriptions like spells against the past. Behold the cross of the Lord. Flee adversaries. The text is not just piety. It is exorcism carved in granite. The church planted this line like a nail, as if to say, the serpent is tamed, the sun is sanctified, the old gods are bound. But geometry smiles at proclamations. Shadows do not read, they move. At winter solstice, the shadow flees to one marker. At summer solstice, it reaches for another. The obelisk keeps Egypt's calendar even while wearing Rome's blessing. Engineers will explain the square's design in practical terms. It is elegant. It is grand. It is a marvel of urban planning. All true. But another plan hums beneath. Obelisks in Egypt were spiritual antennas, stone beams that reached for light and sent it down into temples tuned to receive it. Their tips were often gilded to catch the sun, to mirror the first spark of dawn. Place one at the center of a faith that claims the sun of righteousness, and you get more than ornament. You get a conduit, at least in symbol, at least in memory. A rod that answers to the sky, even as it wears a cross. Some historians insist the move was purely political, a pope's desire to cleanse the square of pagan triumph by mastering its relics. Others argue the choice was theological, a statement that Christ's cross now superseded Egypt's sun. But the stone does not choose sides. It behaves as it always has. It measures light. It writes time. It holds silence that is not empty, but waiting. There are inventories of the move, lists of pulleys, tallies of ropes, names of stonemasons paid and dismissed. Yet there are also gaps. A missing week, a page torn from a ledger, a marginal note about rites performed before dawn, never expanded. Did the church pray an exorcism before the lift? Of course. Did it perform anything older, anything stranger? The records do not say. The square says nothing. The shadow answers with movement. Sometimes, late afternoon stretches the obelisk's silhouette into the basilica's steps. The old stone reaches toward the church as if to knock. The light narrows. The air cools. Tourists drift away. Guards fold their hands and stare at the pinking sky. And for a heartbeat, the square feels like a temple without walls. A place where heaven and stone still exchange glances. Where memory is not a threat, but a tide. Beneath the square, tunnels thread like veins. Some led to storerooms. Some to offices. Some to older rooms that smell of damp and iron. The archives are farther off, walled like a fortress of paper. It is easy to imagine a corridor that begins under the obelisk and ends behind a locked door. Easy to imagine a chamber whose dimensions mimic the base above it, a mirror buried underground. The church denies such romance. Of course it does. What else can it do? To admit a hidden room beneath the most visible symbol of its power would be to invite questions. And questions draw breath. Questions become words. Words become doors. Not everything must be literal to be true. The obelisk does mark a vault, not of stone, but of meaning. The square is a safe that hides in plain sight. People come to be blessed by water and leave blessed by light. They come to hear Latin and leave marked by geometry. They wander through a calendar they did not know was under their feet. A vault above ground. A secret with no need for keys. Egypt lives here. Not as idol, but as axis. Not as rival, but as root. The Vatican could have erased it. It chose to center it, to crown it, to write warnings on it, and then let the sun write back every day. That is not erasure. That is negotiation. A treaty between old and new, between memory and doctrine, between a universe that will not stop speaking and a church that cannot be seen to listen. Stand at the edge of the square at dawn. The sky pales. The dome becomes a silhouette. The needle ignites at its point. Pigeons lift. The first tourists whisper. A guard coughs. Somewhere, a bell tolls. Light pours over the cross and slides down the shaft and pools on the stones. For a moment, the square feels like Heliopolis by another name. The sun writes. The stone replies. And deep below, whether there is a chamber or only soil, the city holds its breath the way it did on that long morning in 1586, waiting to see if the ancient will rise again, and if it does, whether anyone will dare to call it by its oldest name. Picture the scene. A candlelit archive. Dust in the air like ash. A clerk opens a case only long enough to check the catalog number. Inside lies a scroll of fading ink. Its label does not say Book of the Dead or Scroll of Light. It says only Relic of Concern. The clerk signs his name, closes the box, and walks away. Silence remains. The seal holds. But seals crack. They always do. And when they do, words once buried find new breath. Not because priests permit it. Not because popes decree it. But because memory has no master. Egyptian magic endures precisely because it is language. Breath carved into stone, voice pressed into papyrus, syllables written on the sky. The seal can smother pages, but it cannot silence stars. And so the question lingers. How long can silence rule? How long before someone speaks the forbidden aloud and realizes the power was never in vaults or indexes, but in themselves? The Vatican feared the devil, but it feared that realization more. It began as a whisper, not a decree. A command passed in corridors, folded into letters, sealed with wax no one dared to break. Historians later called it the Index, the list of forbidden books. But among archivists inside Rome, another phrase endured, the Sigillum Silenti, the seal of silence. A rule not written for the people in pews, but for those who could read too much. Its purpose was simple. Make sure Egyptian texts stayed unread. The public never knew. Parish priests warned against sorcery in sermons. But they were not the audience. The seal was for scholars, monks, translators, collectors, for anyone who might stumble across a papyrus wrapped in forgotten linen or a codex smuggled out of a desert cave. The rule was not to publish, not to copy, not to even speak. If the words of the Nile gods resurfaced, they must vanish again. Why? Because those words did not just tell myths. They described methods, instructions, spells disguised as prayers, calendars timed to stars. A universe where power did not flow through priests, but through breath, rhythm, geometry. The church feared what those pages could do if spoken aloud, or worse, if compared. For inside them were echoes of Christian rites. Resurrection described centuries before the Gospels, judgment scenes older than Revelation, baptisms carved on temple walls long before Jordan's waters were stirred. The seal of silence did not need thunder. It worked with shadow. Translators were corrected. Printers misfiled pages. Scholars who wandered too far from the script saw their careers dissolve. Books went missing in fires that spared nothing else. Libraries lost shelves to mysterious floods. It always looked like accident, never intent. Yet the pattern persisted. Egyptian magic in, silence out. By the 1800s, the danger returned. Jean-François Champollion cracked hieroglyphs with the Rosetta Stone, and suddenly the dead walls of Egypt spoke again. Scholars leaned close, breath caught, as the stones whispered about souls traveling through judgment halls, about words that raised the dead, about light that could be spoken into flesh. The church could not burn stone. It could not silence translation forever. So the seal shifted. It became subtler. Authorized editions omitted troubling lines. Dangerous spells were labeled hymns. Manuals of the soul became poetry. Still, fragments escaped. Private collectors whispered of papyri that hummed faintly when unrolled. A monk in Spain copied an Egyptian hymn into the margins of a psalter, disguising Osiris as Christ, Thoth as an angel of wisdom. In France, a scholar died after handling a manuscript rumored to contain the ritual of coming forth by day. A Book of the Dead scroll. Officially, he died of fever. Unofficially, colleagues said he spoke in voices not his own before silence claimed him. The text disappeared. Behind Vatican walls, the seal hardened. Cabinets of forbidden manuscripts swelled. Some bore warnings: do not translate, do not copy, do not awaken. The irony was sharp. The church studied them in secret, filing notes, cross-referencing chants, even as adapting fragments. Gregorian chant borrows cadence from older hymns. Ritual phrases echo lines found on Egyptian tombs. The seal silenced the world while keeping the knowledge alive under watchful eyes. It was never about demons. Not truly. The devils were useful masks. To call a god of wisdom a fiend was easier than admitting kinship. To brand hieroglyphs as sorcery was safer than confessing they contained history that contradicted scripture. If Egypt's words were read without filter, then belief might shift. Authority might fracture. Faith might survive, but control would not. That is why the seal endures. Even after the index was abolished in the 1960s, even after modern scholars filled shelves with translations, certain papyri remain off-limits. They are not lost. They are not destroyed. They are sealed. In drawers that hum with absence, in vaults wrapped in lead. The Vatican still decides what the world may hear. Hidden in whispers, dismissed in footnotes, there is a story the church never wanted written. Not about a saint or a heretic, but about a priest, a figure caught between two worlds. Christ's words on one hand, Egypt's spells on the other. Scholars who stumbled across fragments called it, quietly, the Sorcerer's Gospel. It was not found in a grand cathedral or a public library. Its first fragment surfaced in a ruined monastery on the edge of the Egyptian desert, ink fading on brittle Coptic parchment. At first glance, it looked like any early Christian text. It named Christ. It quoted Psalms. But then came phrases no one expected. Invocations to Osiris, chants that mirrored the pyramid texts, rituals of bread and wine paired with words that once belonged to the Nile temples. The priest who wrote it saw no contradiction. To him, Christ and Thoth walked the same road. Osiris and Jesus shared the same passage: death, resurrection, eternal life. He described baptism not as water alone, but as the Jordan meeting the Nile. He called communion a feast of light that echoed offerings once made to Ra. He dared to say the divine was layered, one truth spoken in many tongues. To him, Egypt and Christianity were not enemies. They were mirrors. But to Rome, this was blasphemy. The church had spent centuries drawing a hard line. Egypt was the past, dark and demonic. Christianity was the future, holy and singular. This text dissolved the line. It suggested the first Christians did not erase Egypt. They embraced it. Worse, it suggested Christianity was not entirely new at all, but a continuation, a refinement, a transformation of something older. That was intolerable. The fragments were seized. The monastery that sheltered them burned within a year. The monks vanished, their names erased. Copies that might have survived ended up in private collections, mislabeled, hidden behind false covers. The Vatican claimed no knowledge, but rumors lingered. A papyrus in a cedar case, cataloged but not displayed, bearing verses that sound like both gospel and spell. In its lines, Christ heals the sick with words borrowed from Thoth's hymns. Angels descend in visions described with the star maps of Karnak. The priest teaches his flock that resurrection is not invention, but inheritance. That to speak certain names is to rise with them. He calls memory a form of salvation, light a language anyone can learn. The church could not allow such a fusion. To admit it was to admit that its roots were not wholly its own, that the gospel was not singular revelation, but part of a chorus stretching back to desert temples and starlit chants. So it was silenced, labeled heresy, buried deeper than devils. Yet fragments persist. A line quoted in a Gnostic codex, a margin note in a banned psalter, symbols that appear both in Egyptian tombs and Christian catacombs. Evidence too faint to prove, too stubborn to die. The sorcerer's gospel may be myth, or it may be real, resting now in a drawer beneath Rome, waiting for a hand brave or foolish enough to unfold it. If it is real, then history shifts. The gospel would not be proof of pagan corruption, but of kinship. Proof that the line between miracle and magic, saint and sorcerer, was never so clear. Proof that the church's greatest fear was not Egypt's gods, but the possibility that they and Christ spoke of the same light. And that possibility, terrifying, liberating, is why the sorcerer's gospel remains unspeakable. Because if the faithful knew their faith was built not on rejection, but on remembrance, control would crumble. Faith might remain, but authority would not. Deep beneath Rome, in vaults colder than stone and quieter than prayer, there is said to rest a papyrus with no name. Those who have glimpsed it call it the scroll of light, not because it shines, but because of what it describes. A force that the ancients believed lived in all things, a current of divine energy that could be awakened by word, sound, and memory. It does not preach faith. It instructs practice. Diagrams of human forms surrounded by radiance. Circles within circles showing energy flowing through body and sky. Lines that declare, he who speaks the word with truth becomes the Son made flesh. The words are older than Christianity, older than Greek philosophy, older than empire. And yet, they echo something familiar. Incarnation, resurrection, divine presence, light from light. For the Vatican, this was the most dangerous truth of all. Not demons, not curses, but freedom. The scroll suggests that light is not bestowed from above, not granted by priest or sacrament, but stirred from within, that every soul carries a spark, that awakening it requires no altar but the heart, no intercessor but memory, a truth that could not be controlled. That is why Egyptian magic frightened the church more than the devil. Devils can be cast out, condemned, used as warnings. But freedom cannot. If people believe the divine is within them, the chain of authority weakens. Priests become unnecessary. Institutions lose their grip. Faith remains, but it no longer belongs to Rome. It belongs to the people. And so, for centuries, silence was weaponized. Gods were renamed demons. Hieroglyphs were declared sorcery. Papyri were locked away, mislabeled, burned. The obelisk was crowned with a cross so the sun itself could be claimed. Every act was not about superstition, but about control. Light/dark, memory, forgetfulness, freedom/rule. The same rhythm century after century, yet silence cannot last forever. Words resurface, temples still whisper, stones still cast shadows across time. Scholars keep translating, seekers keep listening, and memory keeps returning like a tide. Even now, on glowing screens and whispered forums, young voices invoke the names of Sekhmet. They study hieroglyphs. They chant rhythms older than cathedrals. They dream of light within. The seal of silence cracks not with fire, but with curiosity. Perhaps that is the greatest irony. In trying to bury Egypt, the church preserved it. In hiding its papyri, it acknowledged their danger. In copying its chants into Latin hymns, it kept the rhythm alive. The more Rome silenced, the more memory waited, and memory does not die. So what remains? not accusation, not rebellion, but recognition. That the divine has always spoken in many tongues. That words can heal, awaken, protect. That names are more than sound. That every human breath is a spell of survival. And that the fear of Egypt was never about evil, but about clarity. Imagine it, a scribe at a Nile temple, ink wet on his reed pen. He writes a name on papyrus, believing that as long as the name is spoken, the soul will never die. Thousands of years later, a tourist stands in St. Peter's Square, gazing at an obelisk crowned with a cross. The sun writes across stone. The shadow moves. And in that movement, the same truth persists. Memory is stronger than silence. The Vatican feared Egyptian magic more than the devil because it could not own it, because it belonged to everyone, because it whispered that God was not somewhere far above, but here, alive in word, breath, light. And that whisper, once heard, can never be forgotten. The story fades now, like a candle guttering after midnight. The storm of centuries still hums, but softer, calmer. The vaults beneath Rome remain closed, but in imagination, their doors are ajar. You can almost hear the rustle of papyrus, the low echo of chants that once rose under desert skies. The fear of Egypt was real, but so was its light, and light, even when hidden, waits. It lingers in symbols, in shadows, in the rhythm of a name spoken aloud. Perhaps it lingers in you. Perhaps it always has.